Hello guys, we're back today with lecture 25 on Johnson's presidency, his domestic programs, and his foreign policy. President Johnson was elected in 1964 despite the fact that he was a strong proponent of civil rights legislation. We will see that when he takes office in 1965, he's going to launch a so-called war on poverty here in the United States. If you'll recall, Johnson really got his start in politics during the Great Depression under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. So he was very much a fan of using the power of the federal government to effect positive change in American society. It's not surprising, therefore, that now that LBJ has the office of the presidency, that he too is going to come up with a similarly grand vision of how he hopes to improve the lives of Americans most in need. So he will create a so-called Great Society set of federal aid programs specifically tailored to address the needs of Americans that were hurting financially. One of these programs was the Medicare program, instituted in 1965 to help insure elderly Americans against medical and hospital bills. Medicaid was also created under Johnson's Great Society programs. This act would help Americans of all ages and those of low incomes to secure help with anything related to hospitalizations or medical needs. Other programs were aimed at trying to get people to work. The Job Corps was created, Project Head Start to offer low-cost preschooling for many American families. The net result of many of these programs was we will start to see a decline in the poverty rate in the United States. For instance, the number of poor in the United States dropped from 25% of the population in 1962 to 11% of the population a decade later. Johnson will also continue his work towards securing civil liberties for all Americans regardless of skin color. We will see him spearheading and ultimately signing into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which will remove some of those lingering barriers that Southern whites had erected towards voting. Things like literacy tests are now outlawed. Further, the federal government will be overseeing some of these elections in troubled areas to make sure that Americans could cast their ballot on Election Day. President Johnson could thus reasonably claim some success with his domestic agenda after the election of 1964. And while he will certainly have critics among white Southerners, for the most part, many Americans were supportive of his Great Society vision. Where he will lose support very quickly will be regarding his foreign policy. Specifically, his pursuit of Cold War aggression against the Soviet Union in Southeast Asia will ultimately become his undoing as president. In particular, it will be the United States stepping up its involvement in Vietnam. The war, as it begins to escalate, will create a great deal of damage to Johnson's reputation as president. It might be useful for us to provide some historical context for why the United States became involved in this area of the world. For the Vietnamese people, located as they are just south of the world power of China, they had for literally centuries been struggling to maintain their independence against first the Chinese. Next, by the time we get to the 19th century, we have European colonial powers coming into Southeast Asia. Specifically, we have French domination of the area known as Vietnam. And in fact, it won't even be known as Vietnam. It will be redubbed French Indochina. For the Vietnamese people, it was a bad dream. Here we go again with another foreign power coming in and dominating us, dominating our economy, telling our people what they should do, how they should speak. They longed for the ability to just simply handle their own business without any sort of outside interference. So the French will dominate Vietnam. That is until World War II. And here we go with yet another outside power coming into the region. The Japanese will be coming into much of Southeast Asia and coming to dominate French Indochina or Vietnam. At the end of World War II, Imperial Japan will be defeated and these areas will go back to local control, except that Vietnam will find themselves also under French control once more. Believe it or not, after World War II, France comes back into this region and tries to reassert its domination over what it considered to be a legitimate colony of the French state. So after all the years of pain and suffering fighting against the Japanese, here come the French again. However, after World War II, we see fierce resistance building, especially under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, towards any sort of outside interference again. In 1945, we'll see a bitter war with now the French until they are finally forced to leave in 1954. At this point, you might imagine the Vietnamese are exultant. They are so happy that they're going to be left alone to their own devices. Only they won't be. Remember, there's an ongoing Cold War between the United States and its allies on one side and the Soviet Union and China and its allies on the other side. In 1954, Vietnam will be roughly divided into a communist-controlled northern country and a southern Vietnam that enjoyed the support of the United States and its Western allies. The informal dividing line will be the 17th parallel, the 17th parallel being that line of latitude. From this point on, under President Eisenhower, we will see that the United States, in its determination to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, began steadily increasing its aid to the South Vietnamese government over time, sending in Green Berets, propping up a very unpopular and corrupt leader there by the name of Diem. And in general, not letting the people of Vietnam decide their own fate. Under our next president, John F. Kennedy, he also only increased the number of U.S. troops on the ground, special troops, not regular troops, trying to convince the Vietnamese people that they needed to side with the United States and not turn into a communist nation. All of this backfires over time, though. The fact that the United States won't let the majority of the Vietnamese people follow their heart and turn into a communist country, which is what the majority of Vietnamese people wanted at that point, only just increased anti-American sentiment in this area of the world. By the time we have President Johnson in office, he too is concerned that the United States was kind of losing its war of loyalty, shall we say, with the Vietnamese people, that the tide seemed to be only increasing in favor of a reunited Vietnam and a communist Vietnam at that. So how did the United States go from sending in a specialized group of advisors to escalating this into a full-blown war in Vietnam? Well, President Johnson cannot simply declare war. Only Congress can declare war. And without an act of provocation, the Congress is not going to do that. The President is not going to ask for a declaration of war and escalate this thing unless he can prove, in other words, that the United States has been unjustly attacked. The President and Congress got their justification for declaring war in 1964. In early August of that year, the U.S. destroyer, the Maddox, was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. You can see the map that I have here on the slide, patrolling off the coast of communist North Vietnam. Reportedly, they were then fired upon by North Vietnamese troops while on an intelligence gathering mission. They were spying. President Johnson immediately seized upon this incident, saying that the United States had been the target of, quote, unprovoked aggression, unquote. He then went before Congress several days later seeking military authority to begin combat action against the North Vietnamese. He also asked Congress for a broad mandate for further future military action. On August 7th, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, authorizing that the president now could take all necessary measures to repel attacks against U.S. forces, and that the president now had the wide authority to take any steps he deemed necessary for the defense of U.S. allies in Southeast Asia. The most important thing you need to know is how vaguely worded and open-ended this Tonkin Gulf Resolution was. By that, I mean there was no timeline set for the president. It did not say that you only have 2 years to accomplish your goal. It was left completely open-ended. Also, the document does not limit or restrain presidential authority. It doesn't say, okay, you're allowed only to send in 100,000 troops. You can't send in any more than that. You have to limit it, your action to this number of bombings. This is basically giving President Johnson and future President Nixon, by the way, complete and total authority to prosecute this war for however long they want, in whatever way they want. By the way, the incident that reportedly took place in the Gulf of Tonkin likely never happened. For example, retired Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, in a 1995 meeting with former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, categorically denied that the North Vietnamese had ever attacked the U.S. destroyer. And in 2001, it was revealed that President Johnson himself, in a taped phone conversation with McNamara several weeks after the passage of this resolution in 1964, had expressed doubt that the attack ever even occurred. To put it another way, the Tonkin Gulf incident probably never happened. It was cooked up. It was manufactured to give President Johnson the ability to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. President Johnson now has the authority to send in large numbers of combat troops. He has the authority to begin incessant bombings of North Korean cities in an attempt to try and stop North Vietnamese forces from crossing over into South Vietnam. However, in Vietnam, the fighting was messy from the get-go. Figuring out who was a Viet Cong, in other words, those groups associated with the North Vietnamese communist effort, and those who were supporting the United States and the struggle for South Vietnamese independence was almost impossible. People didn't walk around with a shirt saying, hey, I'm with the commies, so that you could easily identify if they were friend or foe. So you're sending in U.S. soldiers and giving them an almost impossible task. They're fighting an unknown enemy. They're also fighting in a very hostile physical environment. For the Vietnamese, they have what we call today home court advantage. They know the landscape of their country, the thick forests. They can find hiding places. They can dig tunnels. So again, you are putting American troops in an almost unwinnable position from the very beginning. Remember too that, as we talked about, Vietnam's long struggle for independence against the Chinese first, then the French, then the Japanese, then the French again. The Vietnamese have perfected over centuries guerrilla warfare tactics to try and oust these invaders from their homeland. So again, for American troops, they are not familiar with some of the Vietnamese tactics regarding guerrilla warfare, booby traps, and all sorts of things that will quickly start to lead to an ever-growing death toll for U.S. troops in this bloody and dangerous region. We'll talk more about the war in part 2 of this video.